Appreciate that. I am Ron, incidentally. I've been a volunteer here in a number of respects for almost 30 years. I have to tell you, I spent a good deal of that time studying Mr. Crabtree and his work because I thought a great deal of the man himself and a great wonder at the creations that he brought to us. I was pleased and honored to be chosen to play a very small part in the rebirth in 2006 of the gallery that's often referred to as the Gem of the Mariners Museum. Our team spent literally months and went through reams of paper, creating historically accurate and hopefully entertaining label copy when the gallery was redesigned, renewed, or rebuilt for the first time since its grand opening in 1956, in the year 2006, 50 years before. This is the gallery as it stands today. I was introduced to August Crabtree about 60 years ago. He was a ship modeler in his mid-50s, and he had been with the museum then for just a few years. He was showing off the remarkable miniature ships that he had brought to the museum in 1955. And this is how he brought them. Yep, that's a Chevy step van into which Mr. Crabtree had built about 16 cradles that will hold the collection of ships. He had built a museum in Florida in 1952. Now, he was not an architect, and he wasn't a museum manager. He staffed it with himself and his wife. That was it. No ticket salesperson, no CFO, no marketing manager, no maintenance crew, and no gift shop. How can you make a living with a museum with no gift shop? Well, the museum was a much bigger headache than he had expected. So he reluctantly packed up his ships in the old Chevy van, probably wasn't too old at the time, and went roving around the countryside, the eastern part, to show off his work wherever someone would allow him to, and maybe give him a couple of bucks for the show. Well, he landed at the Mariners Museum in 1955 and showed off his treasures to the staff. The staff and conservators talked him into abandoning this sort of torture to his work and bring the ships inside. He wasn't a living legend at the time, just another, albeit extraordinary, ship modeler who, unlike those few I was familiar with at the time, was still alive. Well, I loved his ships, fell in love with him immediately, and I really wanted to know more about him, about August Crabtree. So I just listened. He said that he was impatient. Didn't sound quite right, but the intense desire to see something completed, I think, would offer a certain degree of impatience. He said he grew to dislike the work on his project. That didn't make a whole lot of sense either. Okay, he was young. He was about 20 years old when he started, and I think he just wanted to get it over with so he could move on to other things. When he started, he said he thought it would take about a year to build a fleet of miniature ships. Many modelers would spend a year completing just one accurate model. He came to call his opus the project, and he said it with a bit of a snarl, but I didn't learn much more than that about August Crabtree. So I started an in-depth study of his ships, all 16 of them. I'd like to think that Mr. Crabtree lost himself often in the history of those ships, as I did when I was researching them. The Melly at the great naval battle of Lepanto in 1571, amid the clash of ramming and splintering war galleys. The men of Columbus's crew at sea on uncharted waters, trying to deal with their constant fears, doubts, and uncertainties, often on the verge of mutiny. the cannonballs whirring overhead and splashing around the 50-gun English man-of-war, battling the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch. The British Navy was ready to pick a fight with almost anyone. The study of these ships in their time is intoxicating. It's enthralling. It's captivating. And there was with August Crabtree a constant and time-consuming effort at research and study so that his could be the finest miniature ships of his time. You have to bear in mind that the things that come as easily to us today, thanks to the internet and very highly sophisticated research tools, came to Mr. Crabtree with difficulty, had to be diligently and painstakingly sought out. He corresponded in the old fashion with naval architects, with archaeologists, with curators and historians in England and Egypt and Venice. Then when enough information was gathered, the laborious process of finding and curing the wood would begin. Then acquiring or making the very specialized tools, then creating each of the parts and assembling the vessel, a vessel as tiny as this, just as it was done in the dockyards where the original was built. Assembly must have felt like a holiday after all those preliminaries. And this was a pioneering effort. Many of our modern tools and techniques did not exist or hadn't been discovered, but the result of his perseverance is this remarkable gallery of 16 1/48 scale vessels. In other words, a 1/4 inch in the model represents 1 foot in real dimension. These models that exemplify the major steps in the evolution of the sailing ship. Well, that's the gallery we're going to explore in a moment. But first, I'd like to tell you a little about the evolution of the artist himself. August Fletcher Crabtree, named August for his birth month, and Fletcher, his father's first name, was born in August, the 29th of August, in 1905 in Portland, Oregon. His father was a railroad man, but his great-grandfather built ships on the River Clyde in Scotland. As a young boy, August, who was often called Gus, was captivated by history and read, studied in libraries at every opportunity. His most valued possession as a young boy was his penknife. He loved to carve and whittle. He also enjoyed watching with his father Fletcher the ships that plied the nearby Columbia with cargoes, passengers. He did work in shipyards during 2 short periods of his life. The GM Standifer shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, right across the Columbia River from Portland. And that was during World War I. And then the Kaiser shipyard in World War II. Therefore, he had some proper training in the structure of wooden ships in the 20th century. The Standifer shipyard built wooden ships until their demise in the 1920s. Well, August moved to California for a while and worked with the motion picture studios, primarily MGM, offering nautical counsel and building models for stage and promotional efforts for movies such as Mutiny on the Bounty, That Hamilton Woman, A Story of Admiral Lord Nelson, Captains Courageous, and several others. While he was in California in 1942, he met and married Winnifred Clark. Winnie had moved from Minnesota to California to stay with an elderly widow for whom she was a chauffeur and a caretaker. She took an interest in his work, which was nearing completion now. He had finished most of the ships a couple of years before, in 1939, and she wanted to help. She took on the onerous job, the Crabtree, an onerous job, of sailmaking and painting. She was naturally skilled at both. Winnifred died in August of 2005, 2 weeks from what would have been her husband's 100th birthday. Well, back to the process of building the ships. August began work in this collection around 1925. He studied wood and its properties, harvested the woods that he felt most closely matched the oaks and pines used in the original vessels, but to a 1:48 scale. Again, a 1/4 inch equals a foot. And he fashioned many of the specialized tools that were needed, from discarded or gifted dental tools and such other items as he could put to his use. Battery clamps, hair clips, clothespins. Then the part he enjoyed most, research. The first ship he built was a model of Mayflower, and it was built from a drawing he had seen in a book. Upon completion, he didn't like it. Further study revealed more about the original ship, and he saw clearly that his model was not only inaccurate, but also didn't appeal to him too much. He gave it away without disclosing the identity of the then unknown creator. Well, his second effort, after studying artists' portrayals of ships, principally the Van de Vels of the Dutch, was the Dutch Admiralty yacht. So this one is the oldest in the collection. Incidentally, the wings that you see port and starboard are called leeboards. They can be raised or lowered to aid the progress of navigation of such a ship operating in the often very shallow waters of the Netherlands. What many don't know is that in the mid-70s, he built a second Dutch yacht, almost identical to this one, but he felt at the time, after 50 years of experience and information, he could do a better job. Well, that ship was given after Mr. Crabtree's death in 1994 to Portland, and it's now the property of the Oregon Maritime Center. As the center has closed its doors some years ago, the ship, as well as the Swedish ship that was still in frame, Mr. Crabtree never finished, being kept either in a bank vault in Portland or a bank vault in Seattle or under someone's desk on the board of the Oregon Maritime Center, which is now the Portland, a paddle wheel stern wheeler. Well then, here's what our museum looked like in 1957. It's clearly a temporary setup. It takes some time to build a permanent gallery in a museum, and the one we visit now is an updated and far more accessible version of the original, which was built pretty much to Mr. Crabtree's general specifications. His ships would be, in his words, floating in air in a jewel-like setting. Note the magnifiers in several of the vitrines. Vitrine is the museum word for showcase. The magnifiers showed the detail in his exquisite carvings. Look down in the lower left-hand corner and you'll see something that might be familiar. This is our Venetian gondola sharing the ad hoc gallery with Mr. Crabtree's ships. Well, the museum entered an agreement with Mr. Crabtree wherein he contracted with the museum for a number of years, and during that time, he was paid as a professional interpreter and woodcarver, and the museum also bought and paid for all 16 of these miniature ships. They were no longer on loan, they were no longer temporary. They became ours right up to the moment. Well, Mr. Crabtree became pretty well known over the years locally, and here he's a featured guest on a morning television show, and internationally. Here's a group of Soviet scientists visiting the gallery in 1974. Mr. Crabtree is second from the left. He also, as a local celebrity, made donations of his work to various institutions around the area to raise funds. One was an exquisite carving that he gave to the Peninsula Nature and Science Center, now the Virginia Living Museum. It was auctioned at a fundraiser. His carvings always brought in quite a bit of money. Ship models are exhibited in every gallery of the museum. They vary in size as they vary in scale and purpose. The variance lies largely in the fact that they range in time from 1500 BCE, before the Common Era, to the 21st century, a span of over 3,500 years. Here's one of the smallest. It's a miniature of the sort of funeral barge that would have borne Admiral Lord Nelson's body, and it was built by a well-known modeler. His name, Donald McNary, and he has written a number of good books on ship modeling techniques. He delighted in the challenge of ultra-small scale. This one is 1/24 of an inch to a foot. The scale is 1 to 288. Mr. McNary died in 2010. And here's the largest of the models in the Mariners Museum. It's the Queen Elizabeth. And it was built by the owners of the Cunard Line in 1939. She was part of a remarkable exhibit of some of the Cunard fleet at the World's 1939 Fair in New York. The scale, 3/9 of an inch to a foot, so the model is over 30 feet long. The Queen is still on the wall of our largest gallery. Have you seen it lately? Nope. It's pretty well hidden behind a false wall in the America's Cup Gallery. Now I want to show you the dramatic effect of scale. Here's the Queen Elizabeth in 1939, obviously in New York Harbor, and here's a 19th century sailing ship. Now I'm going to place a silhouette of the sailing ship in the water with the Queen so that they'll be on the same scale. This is how the two would compare in full size at sea. Surprised? So over a 100-year time span, going from wooden to iron, then steel construction, ships became larger than ever imagined in the glory days of the British East India Company, when the largest of the wooden ships were built. So the question might be, why build model ships? Why build them at all? Well, here's the Mariner's Great Hall of Steam as it was just a very few years ago. It was one of the first permanent galleries when the museum opened its doors in 1933. These models are among the largest in the collection, and most of them were built from detailed plans by shipyard models in shipyard model shops before the ships were built. Once the model was completed, the shipwrights could measure, determine the arcs and curves and lifts, lay out the parts of the ship in full size in very large rooms called mold lofts. So the ships were built from the builder's model. And then as a tribute, a gift, a commemoration, or just decor, a model was often built from the ship. So it's plans, model, ship, model. Most of the elegant ships of its time, therefore, had two pretty accurate models built. So there are a number of reasons to build models, but as we're interested today in one man's life work and the models that he created, we'll look at his reason for spending half of his life up to 1949 building 16 miniature ships and vessels, one at a time. Take a close look at the vessels he built and their histories. Mr. Crabtree had, since his youth, a penchant and a talent for sculpting in wood. He had entered a local craft contest, in fact, in his early years, and his submission was a bas-relief carving of one of the ships he had seen on the Columbia River. The judges would not admit the work for judging. Why? They didn't believe him. They didn't believe that young August, then about 9 years old, could do this kind of exquisite work. It had to have been done by an adult. Disappointed? Sure he was, but not for long. This really cemented his desire to continue his pursuit. Later, while he was visiting in Seattle, he saw a small display of miniature ships in a shop window, and coincidentally noticed a marquee announcement of a show called The Evolution of Popular Music. He was a music lover. This was enough for him. The project that would occupy most of his adult life would be carvings and models of our maritime experience, and it would be a scale depiction of the evolution of water transport. The first completed ship, as I said earlier, was this Dutch yacht, and we'll look at it more closely when we get up to the 17th century. He didn't intend to build in chronological order. The yacht, however, was the first type that he could gather complete and accurate information on. But chronologically, we'll begin in prehistoric times and then move rapidly into the 15th century BCE, before the Common Era. The raft and dugout canoe were the easiest and simplest, of course, and as I understand it, his original raft disappeared during the transfer to the museum. So this is a substitute that was built by him in the museum. Well, this form of water transport, it's a natural, it's simple. Early man knew that wood floats, stones don't. Grab a tree trunk or a limb if you want to travel on the water, not a stone. We'll start the real story in Egypt, and I can't imagine a more recognizable icon than this guy, the Sphinx, or these things. They're called obelisks. We have Hatshepsut to thank for these ceremonial towers and memorials. Many of the sculptures honored her and her brother, husband, Thutmose II. The stones for the obelisks were quarried in Aswan and had to be transported to Karnak, Thebes, Luxor, same place, different names for different times, but it was a river voyage of about 115 miles. They weighed 350 to 4 tons each, 400 tons each. How are we going to do this? This is Hatshepsut's burial temple, Deir el-Bahari, near Luxor. Deeply engraved on the walls of the temple are pictures of the ships Hatshepsut employed to move these stones and other goods up and down the Nile River. And here's a clearer drawing and interpretation of the carving showing 2 obelisk stones, a total weight of over 700 tons, and Mr. Crabtree's rendition in miniature. The vessel is very simple. It's essentially a raft with sides, no keel, built of short, very thick lengths of sycamore, acacia wood, occasionally cedar. This hog truss provides the only lateral stability. Steering was astern, the forerunner of the rudder, the ever-present lotus blossom at the stern, the curled stern itself being a holdover from the reed boats, common even today on the Nile, identify this vessel as very common to the 18th dynasty, the 15th century BCE. The lotus, with its 5 petals representing human extremities, was a sacred symbol and lent life to this inanimate vessel. Now, to evolve the primitive vessel to one more generally useful, especially since the waters of the Mediterranean were a lot rougher than those of the Nile and the Red Sea, a backbone for the hull must be created and introduced, a keel. This bas-relief is in Pompeii, which, as you know, was inundated by Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. It seems to show a Roman corbita or punto, a grain ship extensively used in the centuries around the imperial period. The coin is from the same time and also features a ship typical of the era. The grain ships would hold as much as 70 to over 300 tons of grain and were built on a keel. The ships would not be useful as warships, but Rome didn't really need warships at the time. However, around the 3rd century BCE, the Phoenicians established themselves in Carthage and operated a great trade empire from this base with well-designed and well-built ships. Rome clearly saw this as a threat to the empire and so built a navy, a 100-ship navy that copied the successful designs of the Phoenicians, and thus began the Punic Wars. Remember this guy? Hannibal was a central figure in the wars when all battles were land battles. But Rome now had a navy to challenge Carthaginian trade right out in the Mediterranean. And now Crabtree's replica at 1/48 scale of a first century Roman ponto. The hull is built with the planking laid edge to edge, a building style that has a particular name, but not in this day, not yet. Also, the swan appearance at the stern was common among these ships, as well as the ornate steering oars on both sides of the ship. And it's blue. Depictions of the ship always called them great black ships because they were sealed with pitch and tar. Why is this one blue? Fodder for discussion. How about sails? Well, the single mainsail, as the Egyptians had, but also a foresail called artemon to help direct the ship. You may know this story, but at the stern here, the poop deck, stands a figure. It's said by Mr. Crabtree to be St. Paul, who was, according to the book of Acts, shipwrecked on Malta around 60 CE. Mr. Crabtree admitted that Paul was a bit chubbier than intended and planned to remove him, cut down his girth, and reinstall him. Unfortunately, his lifespan did not allow for that. Now, August Crabtree didn't take his historical eras one at a time. We've just jumped from 15th century BCE to 50 CE, and now to the 11th century CE, specifically the year 1066. By the way, this will slow down a little bit when we arrive at the 17th century and hang around there for a while. But for now, here's an embroidery work that we should all recognize. It's called the Bayou Tapestry, a cruel embroidery work probably created by nuns in the 11th century. Depicts the battle which caused the rise of William, King of England, William the Conqueror. We know the history of William's takeover of England, his brief war with Harold Godwinson, whom he defeated at Hastings, long story behind that also, and his rise to prominence as one of the most influential and enlightened rulers of the Western world. What we don't know is what his fleet of ships looked like in 1066. The tapestry is akin to a cartoon, having very little in detail. Well, we have a pretty good example here. This is an excavation that was opened in 1904 and revealed a Viking ship buried in a funeral mound around the 9th century CE. The ship is called the Oseberg ship because it was unearthed in Oseberg and now resides in a museum in Oslo, Norway. It was incredibly well preserved in the cold clay in which it was found. It's typical of ships of the time. And since William was essentially a Viking, there's a story there too. There's a good example of the ships depicted on the tapestry. So Mr. Crabtree studied current history of the ship and the tapestry. We know that this is William's flagship, ordered by William's wife, Matilda, and named Mora. Legend tells us that it has the cross as a symbol here, which exemplifies its quasi-religious mission. And William's son Robert here on the stern of the ship, or perhaps the bow. Historians are a little still questioning that. But the Duke of Normandy's flagship, he attacked England with anywhere from 250 to 700 such ships, some built, some commandeered. But the structure, unlike the Roman ships, is of planks overlapped like the shingles on a house. It's called lap strait construction. By the way, If you've ever wondered where the term starboard originated, here's the steerboard, the steerborne side of the ship, where the steering oar was attached in Viking ships. Steerborne, steerboard, starboard. Now you know. Details are absent in the tapestry, but abundant in the real ships of the time. So we can easily visualize the invasion and its grisly conclusion with the understanding that, again, it was the ships that made all the difference. Here's someone you should recognize. What's his name? Well, I can give you 3 or 4, but let's just call him Christopher Columbus. He was born in Genoa in 1451 and became a noted navigator and adventurer. He spent a large part of his life developing a plan to sail to Cipango, possibly Japan, or the East Indies, or the Moluccas, lying well to the east, to open a shorter route to trade goods by sailing west, about 2,500 miles, or so he thought. In 1492, at the ripe old age of 41, he left Palos with 3 borrowed ships. He would, through the course of his life, do this 4 times. Discovering for Spain a land that had not existed in the minds of the Western world. But his first voyage is the one we remember. These 3 ships took him, with 90 sailors, to a new world. We surely have the results of evolution here. A stern-hung rudder, a much more involved suit of sails, multiple decks. Most 19th century sailors would have felt pretty much at home in this 15th century ship. We're looking here at the Santa Maria, called La Galea as she was built in Galicia in the northwest corner of Spain. Different from the Pinta and the Nina, as she was a larger ship called a carrack and had an extra sail above her main. It's called a topsail. And here's the Pinta. The Santa Clara, which was called Nina because she was owned by a fellow named Juan Nino, was very much like the Pinta, so it was not necessary to make 2. They're called caravels. Hence, the edge-to-edge planking that we mentioned earlier becomes carvel planking from this period on. Historic ships, yes, they are. But of all of these 16 miniatures, these are the ones we know the least about. A maritime and historical enigma. The Santa Maria made only half of one of Columbus's 4 trips. Okay, Lewis, this is not a ship. This is not a ship. It's a somewhat regal complex. How does it figure into our maritime theme? Let's take a closer look. It is the Casa d'Arsenal in Venice, the royal shipyard, not just the largest shipyard, but the largest industrial complex in Europe. And it was the location responsible for the huge galleys of the 17th century, war galleys. Notice the huge lateen sail rig, difficult to handle due to its size. Venice had a most efficient operation in the 16th century. Her shipyard employed as many as 16,000 workers and had established craft guilds or specialized crews of workers so that those who did the best jobs in specific tasks could ply their trades as others plied their own, even on the same ship. Well, with this specialist setup, the Arsenal was able to impress the King of France on a state visit by building a galley from start to finish in 24 hours. Here's Mr. Crabtree's Venetian galleass of the 17th century. A galleass is a hybrid ship, more like a galley than a ship. 24 hours to build a ship for the king, 48 months to build this very ornate galleass containing about 360 carved figures. Now for something completely different. It's interesting that Crabtree has reproduced ships that have had a significant history. Was this his intent? Well, remember, he's working in the early to mid 20th century. It was difficult to find details on any vessel that did not have a historical significance. But while Mr. Crabtree was researching another vessel, he came upon this interesting reference. At one time, in the late 16th century, about 15,000 of these gondolas worked in the canals of Venice. Today, only about 400 remain. Here's one we saw earlier in the presentation. It's here in the museum. It's owned by the museum and enjoyed a moment of international fame back in 2011 when it was loaned to the National Gallery of Art as a prop for their Canaletto exhibit of art. And this is the famous Doge Francesco Morrisini, who governed Venice in the late 17th century. He was rather flamboyant, and even though he had complete freedom to use the royal barge Bucentaur, he also had made for him a very ornate personal gondola. This is the one August Crabtree happened upon while researching the arsenal at the Harvard Library. It sports about 60 carvings and weighs 1/2 of 1 ounce. It's about the weight of 14 paper clips. By the way, Mrs. Crabtree posed for this one. August was having trouble carving the underside of the maiden's upper arm, so she provided hers as a guide. As she told me this story, she made me promise not to tell anyone, so I never mention it. Now, the study of anything French will invariably involve the monarchy, especially in the 17th century. I'll not go into the details of Oliver Cromwell, the Revolution, the Restoration, except to say that Charles II was exiled in the Netherlands. Well, he rather enjoyed large parts of that exile, especially the working yachts. In the off-season, the owners raced their yachts, and there were hefty monetary rewards for the winners. This was right up Charles' alley. He was not a blue-collar king who worked on fishing boats. He was a 17th century playboy. Here again is the Royal Dutch Stuttgart yacht, the very first built of the collection. Note the sail configuration. We have the huge sail area of the great Venetian galleys, but divided into 3 workable parts. It becomes a much more adaptable and manageable sail plan. The square topsail makes this a Stuttgart yacht. Take off that sail, and we call it a Bison yacht. Either way, it's very ornate and would have served as a messenger and a viso for government purposes. The yacht would be primarily for state use, not a working ship. Charles, admiring these elegant, very agile ships, was awarded one upon the termination of his exile and restoration to the throne. The yacht was named Mary and served as the first of Charles' fleet of yachts, which numbered around 25 at one time. Here is the Dutch yacht, very similar to the one that was awarded to Charles. And here, another one from his fleet, a bit larger. This is the royal yacht Catherine, named for Charles's wife, Catherine of Braganza. As we review these masterpieces, remember they've been structured from the keel up, frames, planking, just as their full-sized originals were in the royal dockyards. Well, most important category in the evolving design and employment of these, the largest moving structures in history, warships. Warships. This is, of course, that other National Maritime Museum, the one across the pond. And this is where Mr. Crabtree found his favorite ship, a 50-gun battleship, a ship of the line named St. Albans. Why St. Albans? Well, Remember, Charlie named the gifted yacht Mary, his mom's name. He named his royal yacht Catherine, she's his wife. But Charles and his brother James had a history of naming some of the royal ships after mistresses or their offspring. And one son of Charles, by this beautiful actress Nell Gwynn, was Charles Beauclerc, first Duke of St. Albans, a thinly veiled reference then to a love child of Charles. The British Museum owns the original builder's model, built in 1687, probably by the shipwright Fisher Harding. Mr. Crabtree copied that ship as his first warship model. Look closely at the carvings. There are about 270, and they are impeccably recreated here in whitethorn, a very dense, slow-growing wood. The building of such a warship was very expensive, but up to 25% of its cost would have been devoted to this elaborate ornamentation. Who paid for the ship? They weren't called taxpayers then, they were subjects. How do you think they felt about spending 25% of the ship's cost on this ornate carving, which did nothing for its efficiency? Now comes a fellow named Louis. No, not this Louis. Here he is. This is Louis the 14th with a bunch of wealthy friends, mostly dukes. He's probably preparing to take them on his private royal galley, Madam. Which one is Louis? Ah, there he is. The galleys were the predominant penal institution in the 17th century, and the oarsmen, typically 5 per oar, were shackled to a chain running fore and aft. They called that job security. A drummer kept up a steady rhythm to make the sweeps more efficient, and this fellow made sure everybody stayed awake. The drumhead, incidentally, would have been of deerskin or deer hide or sheepskin. To scale, that's not possible. Can you imagine why? Mr. Crabtree chose a mouse skin, perfect fit. By the way, while most model builders would carve a ship's boat from a solid piece, it's a minor part of the model. Mr. Crabtree built this one with over 200 pieces of wood. The ship's boat, not the ship. 200. The Louvre, incidentally, has a 10-foot model of the Madam. Now, the only American ship in the fleet is not a ship. This, incidentally, is not Mr. Crabtree's best work. It's not his work at all. A ship in the 1800s has 3 or more masts and sets his sails square-rigged. This is a ship. This is not. How many masts? 2. It's a brig. In fact, a snow brig. In the later years of the 18th century, the U.S. had acquired a merchant brig named Wild Duck. They converted it for naval action to a 16-gun brig named Lexington. Some have called this Crabtree's mistake. Let's talk about it. Mr. Crabtree based his brig on drawings from a 1930 plan and therefore gave it the name Lexington. Upon further examination, certain features of the vessel were anachronistic for the late 18th century. A great representation of the Lexington, surely, but particularly the ship's boats were stowed on crane-type structures called davits. But these curved davits in this position would have appeared several years after the demise of the Lexington. In addition, rods here called jack stays were not used until about 1810. The sails, incidentally, would have been tied to the jackstays. On Mr. Crabtree's ships, the jackstays are there, but the sails are tied to the yards. Mr. Crabtree's miniature was not a mistake. The plans he followed, however, were flawed. Now, we're going to close out with the two biggest ships in the fleet. The British East India Company, chartered by Queen Elizabeth on December 31st, 1600, was the most powerful and longest-lived monopoly in history. In fact, the John Company, as it's known, controlled half of the world's trade. So obviously, other trading nations were regularly in conflict with England's monopoly. And the East Indiamen were armed and well-trained to take care of themselves and their precious cargoes. Building a ship this large, over 170 feet long, required around 400 acres of oak forest, oaks that would take 80 to 100 years to replace. Good English oak was becoming a scarce commodity, and the royal fellsmen regularly patrolled the forests, marking the critical trees with the king's royal arrow. These great oaks would be the exclusive property of the crown, so this ship, an East Indiaman, and not of His Majesty's Royal Navy, would be among the first to substitute lesser woods, pine, elm, and therefore, because of the weakness of these other woods, replace much of the framework, embracing with iron. We're entering another era. Mr. Crabtree's East Indiaman dates to the early 19th century, the last days of the company. Two details are missed by even the careful observer. With proper guidance, you can see here under the quarterdeck a double steering wheel, and here through a gum port, the complete steering gear that makes the rudder respond to the wheels in unbelievably authentic detail. Now, you'll have to see this in person when the museum reopens. It's not visible here. And while the stern is very neat and shapely, we'll not see the prolific ornamental carvings that were commonplace in the century before. Why? The taxpayers. This ship has no planking on its port side. I'd like to think that she's been docked to strip off her planking, replank her, and send her back to sea. Mr. Crabtree often include miniature people on his ship to emphasize scale and appropriate sizes. Well, why would the ship be laid up? Why was it necessary? While she's laid up in dry dock, she can't be productive. Workers are paid to strip her planking. New planking needs purchasing, and then replanking her requires paid shipwrights. She's idle for months and costing the company a pretty penny. The East Indiaman on a trade mission might stay at sea for 12, 18 months on one cruise. There's a danger here to the structure of the ship itself. It's Teredo nivalis, commonly called shipworm. Sort of a seagoing termite, the shipworm bored into a ship's planking and tunneled along the grain, destroying the planking within a matter of months. But the replanking saved the ship, even though it was terribly expensive. Many remedies were tried, only one succeeded in defeating these invaders. Here's the last of Mr. Crabtree's fleet, a bark-rigged ship named, as were many before and since, Britannia. About the middle of the 18th century, the French experimented with a process called coppering. The entire hull of the ship below the waterline was clad with sheets of copper, 14 inches by 4 feet. The cladding was nailed to the planking in an overlapping fashion and was totally successful in keeping out the shipworm and discouraging marine growth, such as barnacles, seaweed. This was Sam Cunard's first steam-powered ocean liner, and she crossed the Atlantic on her first cruise in July 1840 in the blink of an eye. Well, relatively speaking, it was 14 days and 8 hours. A new world record. The ship, built in 1840, exemplifies a huge transition in propulsion and design. Well, the ship contained a steam engine producing about 740 horsepower. And at this age, also being paired with a full suit of sails. The sail plan, the copper bottom, moved the ship through the water at about 14 knots, but when the wind died and other ships were making no progress or even drifting with the current in the wrong direction, Britannia was making an incredible speed of 8 knots and burning through nearly 40 tons of coal every day. The paddle wheels on her sides were not the most efficient use of steam power, but the regularity of regular ocean crossing earned Mr. Cunard an RMS designation, Royal Mail Ship, and a pretty good income. The Cunard line became merged with its rival, White Star. Cunard and White Star merged in 34, and now both have been folded into Carnival Cruise Lines. And here endeth the lesson. I think John Masefield said it best. The romance of the sea off and the burden of worries to those men who work the ships is now replaced by more efficient and more reliable steam power. And according to Dr. Crabtree, what we have after the advent of steam is an iron monster belching great clouds of black smoke into the sky. There's nothing romantic about them. These ships are no more, but their impact on our maritime heritage is forever. So August Fletcher Crabtree's legacy and his contribution to a history that spans over 3,000 years will remind us for generations to come that we are, all of us, mariners.
All right, thank you, Ron. So we got a question here. Says, can you talk a little bit more about how Mr. Crabtree would have painted all those tiny pieces on the models?
The painting
Yeah.
was done by Mrs. Crabtree with very small brushes. Mrs. Crabtree was talked about as a trained artist. She was not. She just happened to be a very skilled painter. She used regular oil paints, studio paints, artist colors, and very, very small brushes in most cases. The painting for an artist would not have been that much of a challenge. The challenge was the gilding, the gold leaf and gold paints that were applied, because they tend to be very hard to control. Mrs. Crabtree just happened to be naturally gifted, very talented.
Right. Got another question here. It said, did you mention Dr. Crabtree? Did he have an honorary doctorate?
An honorary doctorate from, in fact, Christopher Newport College. Yes. Letters.
Great. I have another question here. Is there an estimate on the number of hours Mr. Crabtree put into each of the models?
He thought the whole collection was going to take about a year. So no, he said, and this is just not based on anything at all, he said that his most time-consuming project was the galleon that has 360 carved figures. That's where much of the time went. Now, he doesn't include time for research because he loved that. It wasn't part of the work. Part of the work was putting the ship together. The second most time-consuming was the 50-gun ship, the St. Albans, which has 270 carved figures. That took him around 3 years, and those are his words to me. Have no idea whether it's true or not. When he built in the 1970s the duplicate of the the Dutch yacht, he intended and quoted for a newspaper article to take pictures of it and to keep a careful record of the time spent and the procedures that were involved. He did neither. All of his paperwork went to Oregon with the 2 ships that he sent there, that Mrs. Crabtree had sent there after Mr. Crabtree died, and there's no indication of a time log or building instructions.
Right. Does anybody know if those records had been digitized?
I don't know, but I can tell you that they probably have not been. Most were scrapbooks with pages between big sheets of plywood. The Oregon Maritime Center closed down nearly 10 years ago, or maybe a little over 10 years ago now. It was never a very well-funded museum. They had to upkeep, they had the cost of upkeep on the Portland, the stern wheeler, which would belong to them, and now becomes their de facto museum. I suspect not. We never had the whole collection of papers here at all. So what we have is just a very, very small part of his journals and such.
Okay. Got a couple more questions here. One was, what was the last ship that Crabtree built?
Probably the Pinta. The reason I say that is newspaper articles right up to the 1940s mentioned all of the ships except the Pinta. Looking closely at these ships, in fact, with magnifying glasses, when we were doing the restructuring of the gallery, they were out of their vitrines and we could inspect them very closely. And looking at the very first one, the Dutch yacht, the very first Dutch yacht that he built, and then looking again at the Pinta. There is a degree of sophistication in the Pinta that is not seen in the Dutch yacht. So I believe that the Pinta was the last one that he built, completed that then in 1949.
Awesome. Looks like the last question we have here is, did he build his models using the same type of wood used for the original ships?
Absolutely not. And that brings up a good point. When I said the deer hide or sheepskin on the drum could not possibly have been scaled down, here's why. A deer has fur all over it. The fur grows from follicles. If you take a deer skin and shave it down to the thickness and the size that you want it on a drum that's 1/48 scale, it, in effect, enlarges those pores by 48 times. And you cannot change that. If you take a piece of oak and carve it down the size of a plank that you need at 1/48 scale, you have magnified the deep dark grains in that oak 48 times. What Mr. Crabtree looked for in the deer hide and sheepskin substitute was something smaller with the same features. A deer mouse. He caught one and he skinned it himself. We were talking about the ship and he said, you know, the hardest thing about this was the deer skin. It kept tearing when I was trying to shave it. And I said, Mr. Crabtree, I've counted the wood in your ship's boat. There are over 200 pieces. I doubt that mouse skin was the hardest part of building this ship. He chose woods that had a grain, let's say 1/48, the fineness of a piece of oak.
Great. Well, that appears to be all of the questions that we have today.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you, everybody.
One thing to add, wear your mask, wash often, maintain a social distance.
Great. All right, well, thank you again, Ron, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you on our next program. Have a great day.